Last year, we took an in-depth look into fascism, and while a lot was covered, many nuances were left out. So the point of this series is to try and fill in the gaps, fix the mistakes, and present the basics of comparative fascist studies. In the previous video, Roger Griffin's definition was used, however many details were left out about it. That it's for identifying one, what he calls the fascist minimum. The minimum conditions that a movement or figure must meet in order to be considered fascist. 2. Generic fascism, a general type of fascism from which fascist figures, movements, practices, and policies stem from. And 3. Fascism's ideal type, which contains its primary driver and base formulation for its ideal vision of the world. All of this was found through methodological empathy, which means understanding the political ideology from the viewpoint of those within it. This culminates into a single-sentence definition for fascism as a genus of political ideology whose mythic core and its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultra-nationalism. Let's break down the key concepts here and how their synthesis is what creates fascism. The three are palingenetic, ultra-nationalism, and populism. Palingenetic, the concept of rebirth or recreation. This is an incredibly broad concept as it's existed long before fascism in many philosophical, political, and religious forms. These include baptism, a spiritual rebirth through the cleansing of sin, and reincarnation, the rebirth of the soul in a new body. A common mistake when hearing this term in reference to Griffin's definition is to assume it simply means returning to a previous status quo, or even preserving the existing one. This misunderstanding causes many to conflate non-fascist political uses of palingenesis and reactionarism, conservatism, and liberalism with fascism's usage. Politicians invoking a sense of nostalgia in their voting base is nothing new, as it helps to make themselves seem as if they will bring back the good old days, or at least the positive feelings surrounding it. This can be anything from Make America Great Again, which has been used in some form by U.S. Presidents Reagan, Trump, and even Bill Clinton.
I believe that together we can make America great again.
To even return to normalcy, which was used by U.S. Presidents Harding and Biden. However, when explicitly tied to fascism, it means the rebirth of the ultra-nation through the creation of a new order founded on it. In this way, fascism is anti-conservative and anti-reactionary, as it's not about simply preserving traditional orders or trying to recreate a former one, but hoping to create something new from what it considers eternal elements from the ultra-nation's past, using these as a blueprint rather than a literal return of a previous status quo, while everything else is destroyed to make way for this new historical project. Another way to understand fascism's palingenesis and generic fascism in general is that it can be alternatively referred to as revolutionary organic nationalism. Fascism's pursuit of its ideal world is through dismantling the establishment either through abusive electoral efforts or outright revolt. Once in power, it moves further in its pursuit of creating something new while also rooted. Basically, the creation of this new order, epoch, Reich, empire, era, renaissance, etc., founded on this ultranational blueprint of the past, is creating a type of alternative to the currently existing modernism for a more rooted modernism. This makes fascism a modernist philosophy, not anti-modernist, as it pursues a palingenesis of the modern. Rooted modernism is fascism's ideal alternative to what it considers the current decadent modernism, as it seeks to create it through whatever material and aesthetic means, i.e. depending on what individual variant considers as capturing a future rooted in its ultranational blueprint. Interwar examples of this were seen in both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany through their usage of stripped classicism as an architectural aesthetic, as it exhibited a fusion of classicism and modernism, using it to embrace modern functionality while invoking the heroism of a glorious past. Of course, stripped classicism is not inherently fascist, as plenty of other governments used the aesthetic for their own ideological reasons. What made the aesthetic a fascist favorite was its use to invoke modernity in a landscape while reinventing the essential archetypes of the past. This portrayed an open-ended future from healthy and organic elements. Volkswagen could even be seen as an example of rooted modernism. Adolf Hitler became involved in its early production as it was to be the people's car, an automobile he wanted any family to be able to afford, as it would transport 2 adults and 3 children. You could interpret this as creating a modernist method for the transportation of the organic family unit. In fact, this was such a staple of modernist design that in 2006 it was featured in a museum exhibit called Modernism, Designing a New World. In this dynamic of creating a new era through the essential elements of the past, fascism undergoes a transformative and regenerative process, much like that of the phoenix, as its decaying form bursts into flame, leaving only the ashes it needs to recreate itself in. Keep in mind this fantastical metaphor is simply used to capture a general image and mindset behind this. Its real-life implications are grotesque and hazardous. Let's move on to our second key concept, ultra-nationalism, and more specifically, the fascist ultra-nation. Ultra-nationalism is broadly defined as extreme nationalism that promotes the interests of one state or people above all others. The distinction between it and nationalism seems to be holding a specific nation in superiority to the others. This can come with xenophobia, a mythical emphasis on organic unity, which leads to an anthropomorphized nationalism, and general support for authoritarian arrangements. A non-fascist example of ultranationalism is seen in many instances of conservatism, as it can use xenophobia and an emphasis on organicism to defend a currently existing or even past order from perceived decadence. This is used to save its traditional institutions, such as republicanism, organized religion, and other things from breaking down, as these protect and maintain their ideology's position of power. What is a fascist ultranationalism? Here it means an overtly anti-liberal, anti-parliamentary form of nationalism which precludes the palingenetic patriotism of de Gaulle, a Thatcher, or even a Yeltsin from being fascist, but to embrace the vast range of ethnocentrisms which arise from the intrinsic ambiguities of the concept nation and from the many permutations in which racism can express itself as a rationalized form of xenophobia. It is in this multivalence and flexibility which accounts for the way My Fascist Minimum covers the various concepts of the Italian race accommodated by fascism just as well as the Euro-fascism, Europe of 100 flags, which has become so important since the war. These ethnocentrisms arise from a founding myth that creates the basis for a shared history that shapes the ultranational identity. Probably the easiest way to understand fascism's ultranationalism, and that it's in service of saving it from crisis and establishing a future rooted in it. This founding myth legitimizes itself through deeply mythicized narratives of past cultural or political periods of historical greatness, or of old scores to settle against alleged enemies. Also, vulgarized forms of physical anthropology, genetics, and eugenics to rationalize ideas of national superiority and destiny, of degeneracy and subhumanness. This foundational era has since moved into an era of degeneration by alien entities, causing a cultural decline. This chasm between the foundational era and the era of rooted modernism is inherent to fascism, as its drive to cleanse, destroy, and or remove the currently existing era of decadent modernism is what forms the merging of ultranationalism with Palingenesis in this way. It's mistakenly assumed that the fascist ultranation is inherently justified through racialist and eugenicist narratives, as in the case of Nazi Germany's Aryan ultranation, but this isn't always the case. The Brazilian integralist action movement managed to create their own ultranational struggle and foundational myth from a sense of shared and unique multiculturalism. Roger Griffin remarks, one of the most original foundational myths, blending proto-chronic with Golden Age fantasies, was developed by the Brazilian integralist action, AIB, given the complex racial mixing in a country where indigenous peoples and the descendants of generations of Portuguese colonizers and their African slaves had intermarried through the centuries. Paulino Salgado could not indulge in any scientific notions of biological purity, eugenics, or a mythical ancestral super race. Instead, for him, the essence of Brazilianness that would provide the cohesive spiritual force needed for the country's rebirth lay precisely in its unique ethnic and cultural blend, which had made the rise of Brazil as a powerful modern economy and political nation possible. The AIB thus celebrated the very miscegenation so feared by Nazi, legionary, Hungurist, and Ustasha racists. Until this movement was banned by dictator Getúlio Vargas in 1838, Salgado campaigned for Brazil to be seen as an ideal laboratory in which to demonstrate the power of a racially mixed society to revitalize a nation spiritually and culturally, and hence politically and economically, and so lay the foundations of the fourth era of humanity. With Salgado safely exiled to Portugal, Vargas was happy to promote the AIB's conciliatory myth of racial blending under his own regime. Another mistake is to assume that the ultra-nation can only manifest as a nation-state, but it can also appear in many other forms. It can be an entire race, irrespective of specific state borders, creating a supranational identity. It can also be framed through the unfolding of multiculturalism into separate ethnically homogeneous regions as seen with ethnopluralism, where instead of creating one super-fascist state, this forms multiple fragmented ones throughout the world. It can also be framed as stateless, as seen with national anarchism, where the ultra-nation forms homogeneous communities. No matter the justification for the fascist ultra-nation, it still appeals to a mass of organic members to carry out its vision. This leads us to our final ingredient in the Phoenix pie, populism. Populism is broadly defined as a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. Key terms, ordinary people and elite groups, are what make this term so universal in politics, as both concepts are relative to what you consider ordinary and who you consider to be elite. The socialist sense is that of the working class, ordinary people, against the upper class, elite group. Another way to say this is the appeal of the masses or to a mass of people perceived as dominated by a minority group. Conservative populism appeals to the masses to defend traditional institutions and values from elites that are decaying them. These elites, or people considered working for them, can be anything from cultural Marxists, social justice warriors, globalists, or whatever buzzword is popular for them to abuse ad nauseum. A white nationalist populism, for example, will prescribe the ordinary people as white and the elite groups as non-white, or prescribe just one minority group as elite, which is often Jewish people, and say they are imposing the multiculturalism. Now, is white nationalism inherently fascist? No, this is because its goal of developing and maintaining the white race or white national identity, while inherently racist, as whiteness itself is a social construct that creates a racial hierarchy of whites dominating over non-whites, necessitating white supremacism, has existed long before fascism and can be carried out by other political ideologies and systems outside of it. The early and current United States had and has policies that disproportionately affect people of color. From chattel slavery to the indentured servitude of the prison industrial complex, racial segregation to reverse redlining, the effects and appearance of white nationalism and white supremacism can manifest in many ways. You don't need to be a fascist to be a racist, and thinking this way removes the nuances in which racism can come about. For white nationalism to cross over into fascism, it has to be through an ultranational rebirth. What is fascist populism? Populism here refers to a generic term for the people power generated when enough of the masses are effectively mobilized by mythic energies, whether spontaneous or contrived. Those belonging to the ultranational identity are seen as an organic mass that must effectively mobilize to create an army that will fight in a revolutionary Palingenesis to establish a new order, thus making this populist ultranationalism a palingenetic form. Get it? Because it's Griffin's definition, but the words are reversed a little, being as clever being. Griffin continues to say that the vehicle of revolutionary awakening may be the whole people, or rather all those deemed to be healthy members of it, rather than a particular class or social group. However, in the nation's current state of decadence, the majority are asleep, contained by alien, i.e. patricidal or ethnocidal values, so that is with Leninism, a vanguard is necessary to undertake the heroic task of spreading the vision and seizing power. In the new regime, some of the vanguard of the movement will become the new ruling elite, a natural elite based not on class, power, or wealth, but on the degree of commitment to the ultimate vision of the new national order, and their value to its realization. A deep ambivalence towards the masses as both credulous sheep and potential heroes is thus intrinsic to fascism. The populist base of fascism has since been lost in the post-war period as fascism transformed and mutates itself to the new conditions of mass stigmatization, retaining the core along with every permutation. Using lone wolf or group terrorist attacks to destroy representations of decadent modernism to try and reawaken the ultra-nation. The phoenix will always try to rise again, and it's our job to identify it, but not overinflate or conflate it with other enemies of liberation. As tyranny takes many forms, each terrible in its own way, because it is able to separate itself from the others. Griffin's method requires an empathetic methodology. To fight something takes understanding how it feels, strives, fights, and the world it tries to will into being. However, our empathy stops short of apologetics or support. We should understand the Holocaust, but never defend its architecture.